Thank you very much to Victor and to the Resilience Center and the Stockholm Environment Institute. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk to you guys about geoengineering, which is, as Victor says, a relatively controversial topic. So before diving straight into the conversation about geoengineering itself and the intentional modification of the climate system, I'm going to start by talking about air pollution and geoengineering. And you may be wondering, hang on, what does air pollution have to do with geoengineering? But hopefully I'll be able to explain that. There's been a decision by the International Maritime Organization to reduce the amount of sulfur that's allowed in diesel fuel for ships crossing the ocean. Right now, these ships typically burn what's called bunker fuel, which is basically the lowest crud that you can get out of the barrel, with a lot of sulfur content, a lot of nasty stuff in it. But they're allowed to burn it, and the general philosophy in the past has been they burn it out over the open oceans, and therefore bunker fuel is okay over the open oceans to some extent. But in recent years, they've begun to recognize that port cities are actually suffering from the amount of particulate matter that's coming in from these boats. They burn it when they're burning this high sulfur content diesel when they get near the port. And so that's actually causing a lot of respiratory illness. And the IMO made a decision to reduce by an order of magnitude the amount of sulfur that's allowed in this diesel fuel in order to save what they believe will be something on the order of 35,000 premature deaths a year around the world. This is a global estimate. That's quite a bit of savings by reducing it from the allowed amount of 4.5% sulfur down to somewhere in the range of 0.5 to 0.1% in some areas. That's a pretty substantial reduction. And obviously, saving lives is a good thing from the air pollution community's perspective. But the challenge with this, if we look at this graph in the IPCC AR4, the Summary for Policymakers, it shows all of the different things that we're putting in the climate system that contribute to the forcing of the climate system, a radiative balance. And I'm going to focus particularly on just two components. First off, the CO2, and then the aerosol effect. This is not solely sulfur. This is a combination of both sulfur and black carbon and a few other aerosol particles. But primarily, a very large fraction of this is the sulfur particles that are released from burning of fossil fuels, the diesel in the open ocean, coal in power plants. But you'll notice there's two important things to note about this particular graph. First off, the aerosols are providing a strong cooling effect. And actually, when you add them up, the cooling effect is somewhere between, with those error bars, between 40% and 120% of CO2 forcing. 40% and 120%. That's a very wide range. And the reason the range is so wide is because we don't understand how aerosols interact with clouds very well. That's a big challenge in part of modeling the climate system, is understanding the aerosol indirect effect. How much these particles go in and out of clouds, how white they make the clouds, and therefore how much sunlight is reflected back into space, cooling the planet off. So why am I telling you about this? The reason why is because when you remove that sulfur from diesel fuel in order to save the lives from respiratory illness, you actually are heating up the climate system. You're removing the masking effect that sulfur provides. And the calculation that's been done, and I should point out this calculation was done after the decision was taken by the International Maritime Organization, the estimate is that it will be the equivalent of adding something like 0.4 watts per square meter global average to the climate system. Compare that to the roughly 1.7 watts per square meter that is our total net forcing from all of these different gases, all of these gases and aerosols that we've already got in there, adds up to about 1.7. 0.4 is actually quite a contribution. It's more than a decade's worth of carbon emissions, and if the IMO decision is implemented within the next 5 years, which is roughly its target period, it would be the equivalent of adding more than a decade worth of carbon to the climate system in 5 years, in addition to the carbon we're already putting up there. That's a very substantial contribution towards global warming, towards climate change, that is being caused by a decision made completely outside of the climate regime. The IMO did not consider the climate impacts. It's not part of their mandate. And so they made this decision based on the lives it would save from air pollution. Now, the group that did this calculation pointed out that in order to save those lives, you really only have to cut carbon and cut the sulfur emissions within the roughly 100 to 200 mile radius of the port cities. If you burn the high sulfur out over the open oceans, that doesn't get into the cities very much. So what if we change the ruling of the IMO in order to allow the burning of sulfur, of high sulfur fuels, out over the open oceans, and only put these restrictions in place within the maritime boundaries near cities. That's an interesting proposal. It's an interesting decision that we could take, which would avoid, that would actually reduce that forcing from the 0.4 watts down to about 0.1. That's a substantial reduction in the climate warming effect of that decision. But then you're actually making a decision to intentionally input materials into the atmosphere in order to create a radiative balance. In other words, you're beginning to geoengineer the planet. This is why I start with this, in the geoengineering talks, by talking about this decision in the International Maritime Organization, because it emphasizes that the interconnections that we have between different governance regimes, between air pollution and climate in this case, actually can lead, in the way we begin to just think about these problems, can lead to decisions to intentionally modify the climate system without introducing any new technologies, without introducing any new techno fixes or new radical ideas for interfering in the climate system. Some of the decisions we're already making are moving us in that direction because of how big the anthropogenic influence on the climate already is. Now, there's other places where this is important. This is a nice paper by Drew Schindel that looks at the long-term climate impact of of coal plants built in China, particularly ones built with or without sulfur scrubbers. And I won't go through the details of this graph, but the main important thing is if you put on sulfur scrubbers on all your plants to begin with, they have a warming effect from the time they're built. But if you actually don't put in the sulfur scrubbers to begin with, you end up cooling the climate down. Every new coal plant built without sulfur control cools the climate for at least the first 20 to 30 to 40 years of its existence. Of course, that's not necessarily a good idea to build coal plants to do that, but it just emphasizes that this is actually, once you begin to think about managing all of these different atmospheric pollutants at the same time in their radiative balance, it becomes a much more complicated conversation than just managing CO2. So, with that introduction to thinking about geoengineering, I'm going to go through now a little bit of what geoengineering technologies are talked about and what geoengineering means in the general conversation context. It should more accurately be called climate engineering rather than geoengineering, because it really is just specifically about the climate. And the definition that's been used by the UK Royal Society to structure the reports and the panels that I'm on, and is being taken into the IPCC, is that geoengineering or climate engineering is the deliberate and large-scale, regional to global, alteration of the climate system, particularly with the objective of ameliorating or moderating climate change impacts. So to try and make the impacts of GHG-induced climate change a little bit weaker. Now this is what people often think of when they think about geoengineering. The mad scientists trying to figure out ways to tweak the planet. That's often the sentiment that it evokes. But again, this is why I start off with the conversation about the IMO, to recognize that actually it's not just these big techno fixes or these crazy scientific schemes, but perhaps an extension of the way we are already intervening in the climate system and might be a framework for thinking about how we intervene intelligently. The global heat flows and energy balance is a diagram that I'm sure many of you have seen. I'm not going to go through it in much detail. I'm going to go for the much simpler version, which I prefer, which is a nice sun and demonstrating that out of the 100% of sunlight that arrives on the planet, at the planet's upper atmosphere, 70% of it is absorbed and goes into the climate system and drives our climate system and gets absorbed and turned into long-wave radiation. 30% of it is reflected away without being absorbed into the system, the short-wave radiation. Now, in terms of geoengineering techniques, they come in two categories. The first focuses on the mistakes that we've already been making, the greenhouse gases that we have in the atmosphere, and asks whether or not there's ways to remove the carbon from the atmosphere to begin with. Are there ways to actually pull down concentrations? It's called carbon dioxide removal. And I'll show you a couple of techniques in a minute that have been proposed for doing this. The other one that I'm going to focus on, the solar geoengineering technique. So these are called carbon dioxide removal or carbon geoengineering. The other one's called solar radiation management or solar geoengineering, tries to tweak the amount of light that gets reflected away from the planet before being absorbed by the climate system. So if you just reflect a little bit more away, just like the sulfur particles in the troposphere already do, then you can cool the climate down a little bit. Now, what are some of the examples? I'll just go through this very quickly. In terms of carbon geoengineering, or CER, there have been some proposals for artificial trees. I like these. These are a couple of pictures from colleagues of mine, Klaus Lackner and David Keith. They don't look very much like trees, but the whole idea is that these are big air scrubbers, just like you would have on the spaceship, that takes in air, scrubs out the CO2, and puts out oxygen on the other side as a result. Now, the challenge with these is in order to take out 1 gigaton of carbon from the atmosphere in a year, so we put up about 8 gigatons of carbon right now in terms of anthropogenic emissions. To take out 1 gigaton, you would have to build a structure the height, the width, and 5 times the length of the Great Wall of China. Case in point. Now, that sounds like a huge amount. But at the same time, when you actually do the calculations and look at that compared to mining industries, compared to construction industries, bluntly compared to the construction rate in China, that's actually not so crazy after all. Now, the problem with these technologies is they would take a long time to build, they take a long time to perfect, there'll be lots of technical challenges, and they are also energy intensive. So you'd better be getting that energy from renewables, because if you're burning coal, that's not actually a very smart way of doing this. But it provides at least a framework for being able to intervene to remove the carbon in the long run. Other techniques that have been proposed include enhanced uptake of carbon through the oceans, and there's a number of ways to simulate that. The most commonly known is ocean iron fertilization. You dump a bunch of iron in the ocean and it stimulates the growth of algae. This is an example actually off the north coast of Norway and Sweden, where iron sometimes gets washed out into the ocean and you get this big algae bloom as a result. And the idea is when this algae blooms, it then dies and sinks to the bottom of the ocean, ideally taking the carbon with it. But testing that and demonstrating that is actually a tremendously difficult process. So there's a range of calculations around this that range from it can't take much carbon at all out to it can take out a lot, and there's a lot of scientific controversy over what it would do to marine ecosystems. So none of these technologies under the CDR or carbon geoengineering are easy techniques to do in the short term. So it's not easy to pull down atmospheric concentrations, which is what has led to conversations about solar geoengineering. Scientists getting very concerned that we continue to emit too much carbon, the impacts of climate change are coming on faster than we expect, so what could we do to cool the planet off, to put an ice blanket on the planet, to slow down the rate at which climate impacts are beginning to manifest? I'll talk about two technological ideas in particular. The first one is, both are based on increasing the reflectivity of the atmosphere. Now, you may have heard of techniques like space mirrors, putting mirrors in space in order to reflect sunlight away. Considering NASA's lack of ability to continue to put astronauts in space at the minute, the idea that we're going to lift the trillions of tons of material that would be needed in order to accomplish real space mirrors, we'd actually have to expand our launch capacity of the planet by somewhere around 10,000 in order to do it. So it's not very practical to put up space mirrors of any size anytime soon. But increasing atmospheric reflectivity is something that we already do unintentionally now, so how could it be manipulated? One of the prominent proposals is called cloud whitening, seeding the clouds with more cloud condensate nuclei in order to grow bigger clouds or make the clouds brighter. And the proposals, this is one of my favorite pictures, they've actually designed and engineered ships that would be wind-powered, that would go out into the ocean and create aerosol particles out of seawater, basically sea salt aerosol particles, which would help provide more CCNs, cloud condensate nuclei, in order to grow bigger and whiter clouds. And there's a range of modeling teams in the world now that are starting to put these into regional and global climate models to see what the impacts might be. The impacts could range from precipitation changes through to temperature changes, or both combined somehow. The other one, which I'll talk about even more, are atmospheric aerosols. I already talked about the troposphere and the fact that simply managing what we put up already is potentially one knob. But I'll talk even more about stratospheric aerosols, because this is the one that has raised the most interest. Paul Crutzen published on it in 2006 and actually revived the geoengineering discussion, or gave life to the geoengineering discussion with his proposal to do what Mount Pinatubo did. In 1991, when Mount Pinatubo blew up, it injected somewhere around 10 megatons, 10 million tons of sulfur particles up into the stratosphere, above the clouds. Now, it's important that they got above the clouds because the sulfur that we typically put up in the troposphere rains out in something like a week. Somewhere around 7 to 10 days is the half-life because it's in the clouds and it's just constantly precipitating out. But when you get the sulfur above the clouds, it actually simply floats up there and sediments out by gravity, which takes a much longer time. It actually has a half-life more like a year and a half, as opposed to 7 days. Makes a big difference in terms of the lifetime, and also in terms of the climate impact. After Mount Pinatubo went off, the eruption happened in late 1991, mid-1991, and this top graph is a graph of the aerosol loading of the stratosphere. This is measured using laser interferometry and a few other techniques to just measure the aerosol optical thickness in the stratosphere. And you can see very clearly the peak and then the decay of the optical thickness, showing that the particles went up, and over a period of about a year to a year and a half, they sedimented out. The more important graph is this bottom one, the temperature. Exactly mirroring this stratospheric aerosol injection is a decrease in temperature amounting to about 0.5 degrees centigrade in 1992. That's a pretty significant drop in temperature. This is global average temperature that's calculated here. And that drop is because this reflected somewhere around 1% of the amount of incoming solar radiation, 1% more away from the stratosphere. So it wasn't absorbed into the climate system. Now the question, of course, that Paul Crutzen raised in 2006, and others had raised before him, was, well, what if we did that intentionally? What if rather than just waiting for a volcano to go off, we actually did this to cool down the global average temperature to offset the greenhouse gases that we're putting up there? Now, one or two scientists, possibly not thinking fully about this, suggested, well, what about nuclear bombs and volcanoes? No, that's a bad idea. So they thought about what else could be done instead. How would you actually inject these particles with any level of control? And of course, you ask a bunch of engineers and scientists that sort of question, and you get a range of interesting answers. My personal favorite is this one in the bottom corner, the howitzer. It's basically a big naval gun that if you point it straight up in the atmosphere, can fire a shell to somewhere around 40 kilometers. So if you wanted to simply fire a couple million tons of sulfur up into the stratosphere, of course you have to figure out how you're going to disperse it once you get up there. You know, just exploding a shell probably won't work well. You need to figure out a nozzle and stuff. But it's entirely plausible to engineer that sort of a system. You can do the back of the envelope calculus and ask how many howitzers would it take firing at their normal rate that they do on a naval ship in order to offset a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere in terms of global average temperature. And the answer is 10. 10 howitzers pointed straight up in the air, firing 1 shell a minute, which is actually a lot less than their firing capacity. Now you have to worry about replacing the barrels and where you get the sulfur from, so maybe we make it 25 so that we've got some redundancy. But the point being, it's not a lot. Actually lifting this sulfur up into the stratosphere is not technically a huge challenge. And actually, this is not the smartest way to do it. David Keith, a colleague of mine at the University of Calgary, commissioned an engineering team to sit down and think what's actually the most cost-effective way to do this and the safest way to do it. Firing guns is generally not considered the safest way of doing it. But you could retrofit a handful of existing airplanes to get a little bit higher capacity into the stratosphere because you want to get them a little higher than conventional aircraft go. And you would need somewhere on the order of $1 billion to $10 billion a year in order to offset a doubling of CO2. $1 billion to $10 billion. Now, why is that so important? How many of you remember what the Stern report estimated was the cost of actually changing over our fossil fuel infrastructure in order to mitigate climate change? Somewhere in the trillions of dollars a year, or at least the hundreds of millions. So this price, or hundreds of billions. So this price tag looks pretty affordable when it comes to global climate policies that we're talking about. Now, of course, that's simply to do it. That's to get the material up into the stratosphere, and there's some technical and engineering challenges that would need to be associated with that, but those are minor. These are the sorts of things that you put an engineering team on for a year, they can figure that out. The challenge with it is what does it actually do to the climate system? Is this at all equivalent to reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And the short answer is no, it's not. Global climate models, so let me just take a step. They'll come back to this in the politics, but the point being at that sort of a price with this sort of a technology, a single nation could actually do this. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But what would SRM actually do? This is a map that comes from Alan Roebuck's modeling of SRM. There's a range of groups that have begun to model this sort of solar geoengineering and global climate models. And what you end up finding is that if you actually want to offset the temperature, the average heating of the planet, first off, you're not going to offset it uniformly. We all know that the Arctic has warmed up a lot more than the tropics have due to global warming. And it's not clear that SRM, that solar geoengineering, is going to change, is going to influence the climate in the same way. And also it influences precipitation very differently than it influences global average temperature. Now, why is this? When the sunlight comes in and gets absorbed by the open ocean, a lot of that energy is absorbed into the dark water, driving the transpiration cycle. It evaporates a lot of water and sends that up into the clouds, leading to the precipitation that you get down the road. If you remove a little bit of that sunlight and offset it by just turning the climate temperature up a little bit, which is what CO2 does, trapping long-wave radiation, that slight increase in temperature does not equate to the same amount of evaporation. It's kind of like turning up just a tiny bit the temperature of a pot of water on your stove. You don't get a lot more water coming off of that. So the point being, if you cool the planet down with solar geoengineering, at the same time as heating it up with long-wave radiation, you actually can reduce the amount of precipitation you get quite significantly. And the first climate models that have run on this, granted these are not the best climate models, these are low resolution, but they show the brown means places where precipitation has gone down, and you see a tremendous belt of brown right through the tropics and right through the mid-latitudes, hitting places like the Indian and African monsoons. Places where, particularly in the Indian and the Asian monsoons, you're looking at 1 billion people, 1.5 billion people relying on that for food and water. Pretty significant societal impacts. This drives home the main difference between the solar geoengineering and carbon geoengineering. So in comparing the two options, I look at 3 basic critical parameters. The ability to counteract greenhouse gas-induced climate change. How much do we get back the climate we used to have if we use this type of geoengineering? The technical feasibility of how easy it is to do, how quickly you could do it, and how little it costs. And the time scale. How quickly could you actually do it if you had to? Starting with CDR, or carbon geoengineering, if we just took the carbon out, we'd actually get back the climate that we used to have. Minor hysteresis, we've lost a bit of Arctic sea ice, we've lost some things, but mostly, besides that hysteresis, you would get back a lot of the climate you used to have. But as I mentioned, the technical feasibility and costs, 5 times the length of the Great Wall of China to build, means that it would take a long time to deploy, and the cost would be roughly the same as mitigation is today. It's not actually, the sort of carbon removal schemes of geoengineering don't provide any silver bullets. There's no quick fix. Solar radiation management, or solar geoengineering on the other hand, starting on this end, the time scale of deployment, we saw from what Mount Pinatubo did, you can get the climate to respond to this sort of intervention within months. If you really wanted to cool the climate down, you could do it with a fleet of about 10 aircraft, starting tomorrow, and by midsummer we have a cooler planet. The costs, 10 aircraft. 10 aircraft, a little bit of engineering, somewhere around $1 billion a year. That's peanuts by comparison, that's a rounding error in the US budget. Problem is, its ability to counteract greenhouse gas-induced climate change is unknown, and early studies suggest not very good. Mount Pinatubo had some side effects in terms of decreased ozone, in terms of changing precipitation patterns, but it was a very short intervention. It was a blip that went away, and you don't actually learn much about the long-term impacts of doing something like that from a quick transient experiment. So it raises the question about what would a long-term intervention look like. But at the same time, weigh those risks against the risks of greenhouse gas-induced climate change, the potential for tipping points in the climate system, the damages we're already beginning to see the early tail of from the climate change we're going to have now. It raises a question of how do we begin to think about this as a potential another lever on the climate system. Should we begin thinking of it? What more do we need to know? How do we govern it if we do? The basic governance or policy questions that it raises along these lines are, first, will even talking about sort of solar geoengineering begin to reduce the motivation to mitigate? If people think, hey, We can just put up some sulfur. Why do I have to reduce my greenhouse gas emissions? That might, given everything that we know so far, which is that it's an imperfect substitute, that could be a very significant political danger. The other one is who gets to control the climate? Who gets to make the decision about when and how to use solar geoengineering? Like I said, $1 billion a year, a rounding error in the US budget, 10 airplanes. How many countries have within their capability today 10 airplanes, $1 billion a year budget, and a desire to potentially control the climate system? It raises a lot of geopolitical challenges. It raises a lot of governance challenges. And at the moment, these are two really important questions to think about. But we have an opportunity now, because we are at the very early stages of solar geoengineering research. These are technologies that are just beginning to be thought about. No one's got a solar geoengineering technology ready to go and launch the aircraft yet. There is more research that's required in terms of how you would disperse the particles, what nozzles you would need, what altitudes, more modeling studies to be done. But the way in which this research happens is going to set the foundations for how the technologies may be governed in the future. Who does that research? How do they do it? Who are they reporting to? Is it public good? Is it private? Is this all done by Halliburton or the Department of Defense in the US or in China? Or is this done in a global consortium of publicly open and transparent research? That will potentially make a huge difference in how these technologies are evolved into the future. And so we have an opportunity in the next handful of years, while the early parts of the research are going on, to begin framing this discussion in ways that may promote future global public good. This is why I've been a part of this UK Royal Society-led effort on SRM, or solar geoengineering governance, trying to promote a discussion, not trying to promote geoengineering technologies per se, but promote a discussion about how they might be governed. And there's a range of people here, Clarice Siebert and Victor, among others, who are engaged in this discussion along with me. And it's an important discussion that people and policymakers in developed and developing countries need to begin to think about. Now, I'm going to very quickly go through the types of research that can be done, because each of these types of research raise different geopolitical issues, different governance issues. The first is theory and modeling. Now, theory and modeling has actually been going on for the last 10, 20 years. People have been modeling geoengineering interventions, solar geoengineering interventions, and thinking about what if. That doesn't really raise a lot of geopolitical issues. At least so far, no one has actually tried to model how does India get more rain at the expense of China. But it's possible that when people start doing those sorts of modeling experiments, if they do, that may begin to raise geopolitical issues. So for the most part, theory and modeling has been benign so far. It's been scientific and in the public sphere. But there are elements of it that could begin to add geopolitical dimensions, could begin to add security concerns. Once you start getting into technology development, even just in the lab, not out in the field yet, but just in terms of building the aircraft that can go to that altitude, building the spray nozzles, doing tests about particle size distributions in cloud chambers, you start to raise issues about ownership of that technology. Is this being done in a private lab where someone's taking out patents on this technology? Or is this going to be done in a public international consortium where all of the intellectual property belongs to the global commons? It's an open question. Right now, there is no governance framework dictating any of that. Even more important is what happens when someone decides, well, I've got an airplane and I've got a nozzle and I think they work, but I really need to take it up to the stratosphere and just spray a little bit. I don't need to spray much, but just a little bit to see whether or not my nozzle works and my plane works. Well, okay, I've sprayed a little bit, now I need to spray just a little bit more to make sure it works really well. And well, now I just need to be able to see, just over a small area, how much radiation it reflects away and what the particle sizes are. When you see the slippery slope. It opens up the question of what do we determine is subscale research with a negligible climate impact? Where do we define the risks? And then where do we draw the boundary between that and actually starting to test the climatic impacts? Actually saying, you know what, I want to do a field test over the Arctic next summer to see if I can prevent the sea ice from disappearing nearly as much as it did last year. Because I actually want to preserve the Arctic ecosystem. Where do we draw the boundaries between that? Who gets to draw the boundaries between that? This idea of drawing a boundary between acceptable subscale field testing, even within the boundaries of one country, and what's going to be considered to have international impact and present international transboundary risks is an extremely difficult issue, and we don't yet have a forum to discuss that. So, questions governing solar geoengineering research. Some of the key ones that I put forward, and there's different ways of framing this, but I frame this in terms of a question of legitimacy. Who should or will, and actually the difference between should and will in reality is it can be very large, and so both questions have to be asked, one a realpolitik and one a more of an ethical or ideal world one. Who should, will decide on when to conduct what level of research? Who should or will all of the generated knowledge and technologies be public? And how should or will deployment of the produced technologies be regulated, and by who? Now, at the moment, there are a range of actors who are important for this conversation, but very few are yet involved. The scientific community is starting to become more involved, but even there, it's a small subset of scientists, myself included, who are part of this conversation. It started to penetrate more widely in the UK Royal Society, the National Academy of Science in the US, some European research funds. You'll notice I'm mentioning mostly northern white countries. That's because that's where the conversation has happened so far. And that's a very significant geopolitical issue. There's also the issues of private actors and corporate actors. No one's regulating this right now, so why can't companies begin taking out IP? National governments, how are they going to frame, whether in the north or the south, their national interests relative to these sorts of geoengineering technologies? And civil society. If we're going to start testing technologies or even developing technologies that could impact every person on the planet, typically in medical research, we insist on informed consent before testing on somebody. How do you get 7 billion people to raise their hand and agree to a field test? It raises a whole bunch of questions about the governance mechanisms and structures. And it also, just based on all of these different interconnections, is connected to a range of issues in the international sphere already. Development, do we have a responsibility to use these technologies to protect vulnerable populations? Where are developing countries in thinking about how these technologies should be used and when? There's obviously the international security issues. What happens if one country decides to do this on their own, or a small coalition of a willing form? I already mentioned air pollution at the beginning. How does this begin to interface? Once you begin down this conversation about global interventions, you can start the conversation two ways, with the air pollution conversation that I did at first, or with the development of the global technologies, but they meet in the middle somewhere. And that ties back to, of course, the climate change conversation. How does this relate to CO2 mitigation? How does this relate to the governance structures that we have, the ways in which we make decisions about the global climate system over the long run? I'm going to skip through this slide and maybe come back to it at the end if there's a little bit of time. But this is the global regime complex as outlined by Cohane and David Victor, Mike Cohane and David Victor. And it maps out a whole range of institutions that are currently involved in the climate change arena, ranging from the formal UNFCCC processes and Kyoto Protocol through to the IPCC, ranging down to multilateral development banks and unilateral action by California industry, the different clubs like the G20, the MEF, the G8+5, financial markets. It's already quite a cluster of different organizations and actors all involved trying to figure out how to manage largely just the carbon problem so far. Even short-lived climate forcers like sulfates, which I started out in the air pollution conversation with, are not well integrated into this conversation yet. Black carbon's another example that's only beginning to get integrated into this framework, largely because people view it as co-benefits. You can get benefits for air pollution and for climate by reducing the amount of black carbon, because it's different than sulfur. Black carbon actually warms the atmosphere and causes air pollution. Good to get rid of it on both sides. Sulfate cools the climate and causes air pollution health issues. So you get rid of it, you do good things for health, but potentially bad things for the climate. How do you integrate that in here, and how do you begin to integrate the issue of geoengineering research and technologies? Part of my research group focuses on this, and we've gone through, I'm not going to go through this entire chart because there's nowhere near enough time, but we've gone through some of the most relevant, at least the ones that we think might be most relevant, the international organizations that could have something to say about solar geoengineering, ranging from CLRTAP, deals with sulfur emissions, particularly in Europe and North America with air pollution issues. They might be able to have something to say about emissions of sulfur in the stratosphere. They at least have scientific bodies and a governance structure that could deal with it. But they're not global. They're regional, and they're missing some very important actors at the table. The International Maritime Organization has clearly made some decisions already about removing sulfur, but it didn't even consider the climate impacts in the first case. Does it have the institutional capacity to do that? And we can keep going down this list. The UNFCCC is a very important one. In principle, the UNFCCC's purpose is to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. But in practice, the vast majority of the UNFCCC conversation focuses on carbon, because it is absolutely the single largest long-term threat to the climate system. But in the short term, in the next 20 years, the amount we mitigate carbon actually isn't going to change the temperature in 2030 very much. And all of these short-lived climate forcers, and certainly the issue of geoengineering, is not part of the main negotiations of the UNFCCC that constantly go on at the COPs every year. In the background is a conversation about short-lived forcers, but not even, geoengineering isn't even on the radar in the background very much. Given this sort of a structure, the short version of this is that there is no single institution out there. There's not even a set of institutions that collectively manage or collectively cover all of the issues raised by solar geoengineering. It raises the question then, how do we begin to govern this? How do we begin to design a process? Do we design an independent process or an integrated process? What do we do? Now, the issue has raised to the point where there is actually science, not only scientific, but media and political attention being paid to geoengineering. I already mentioned earlier on the sort of scientific attention being paid by the National Academy of Science in the US, some leading respected scientists in the field, the UK Royal Society, all doing reports in the last several years on solar geoengineering technologies. Meanwhile, there's also been some politically motivated publications talking about, ooh, geoengineering, maybe this is a fix, maybe we don't need to worry about mitigating. Quite concerning in that they get a lot of the science wrong, but they can frame it in an economic language that potentially looks quite beneficial, emphasizing that there can be political agendas that start getting played through this. And that's no surprise to anyone in the audience, but it's just the fact that it's already begun to happen. And overlaid on this are some of the discussions within the UK Parliament and the US Congress, various hearings that have been held to start asking the questions, how do we regulate it? Now, for the first time in history, the US Congress actually ran joint hearings with another national government. They ran it with the UK, so it's, they're not stepping out of their comfort zone too far. But the very fact that the US Congress acknowledged that another government exists and actually held joint hearings with the UK on geoengineering emphasizes that the uniqueness of solar geoengineering and the issues that it raises actually requires new approaches to the way we think about collaborative governance. And over top of that, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the first international organization to pass any sort of a public decision on geoengineering. This happened last year in, I think it was October or November in Nagoya in Japan. Now, the decision that they passed was fairly ambiguous from a legal point of view, but it was a very important normative statement. The normative statement was, we need to be aware of geoengineering, we need to be damn careful of what we do in experimentations, and we need to begin doing scientific studies to prevent these technologies from simply rushing ahead and being developed by individual nations that may have national interests. In the interest of time, I'm going to skim through very quickly. Within my team, my research team back at Center for International Governance Innovation, we've run through some gaming exercises, assigning people different roles that they would play. Now, these are caricatures. We're not actually saying that an emerging economy would necessarily promote geoengineering, but in the case that they would, how might they start running agendas through the existing governance regimes in order to achieve their goals? And we're doing these sorts of scenario gaming exercises precisely because how do you begin to plan a governance structure when you have no idea how the issue is going to evolve? We need to at least begin to map out the range of potential political actors and actions that could be taken and the people that could be involved. And we've actually learned a tremendous amount from just doing this once. And we're now starting to run exercises in workshops with policymakers in developing countries. The basic countries are next, and least developed countries as well, to begin to understand what their perspectives on these issues are going to be. Now, in developing governance mechanisms, there's a number of ways to go wrong. Governance traps. And I'll very quickly summarize those. The first is jumping the gun and constraining research. In principle, this is a reaction that a lot of people have. Whoa, dangerous technology. Let's just stop and not do research in that because it's so dangerous. The problem is, as we've seen in technologies like stem cells, when responsible countries stand up and say, we don't want that sort of research here, the researchers normally go, all right, I'm going to go over here where they're going to let me do this. And the technologies begin to develop in places that don't necessarily have the same restrictions or the same level of responsibility that we may want. So it's not clear to me that jumping the gun on putting just immediate constraints on is actually going to achieve the desired goal anyway. And also, given all the risks of tipping points in the climate system and all of the potential need to protect vulnerable populations around the world, maybe we actually need geoengineering technologies. I don't know. I'm still agnostic on that. There's the existing institution mechanisms. Try and get the Montreal Protocol involved because it's in the stratosphere and could impact ozone. Try and get CLRTAP involved because it governs sulfur emissions. But the problem is, these institutions aren't built to manage a climate system. They're not built to manage the radiative balance. And the problem is, once you get it in there, what's the problem with lock-in? And how much can you actually get it back out into a governance system that's more structured for it once it's in there? And how set are those institutions for dealing with the long-term climate management? So far, the UNFCCC hasn't been very good at this, so I'm not sure that throwing it at them is necessarily the right answer either. But that leads to the question of, do we really want another negotiation process? Do we want a geoengineering discussion going on, a new geoengineering treaty or geoengineering institution? One more institution added to an already crowded landscape, another negotiation to get deadlocked? It's not clear to me. And of course, there's the possibility that we all just sit back and say, well, let's see how this evolves. But what happens then when countries or individual actors begin to get to a stage where they're actually wanting to do field tests, and there still hasn't been an international discussion about it? What sort of geopolitical issues does that face? Sorry, I know this can be a relatively depressing talk at times, but I'll leave you with the questions and hope you can help me find some answers here. And I'm just going to end very quickly with a discussion that Victor and I have been having just over the last few days of thinking about the overlap between planetary boundaries and planetary engineering. And the question of, geoengineering has been developed with the concept of managing climate change. But of course, there's all of these other planetary boundaries that we're potentially trespassing on or moving towards already. And we already have a range of engineering or systems management approaches that we deploy in everything from, so where's land use change here? Change in land use. How many ecosystems do we actively apply ecosystem management techniques to? How many freshwater systems do we already try and provide some sort of systems management with a whole range of levers that we pull artificially? Is that actually that different from geoengineering? Particularly when you start taking all of those impacts in aggregate. When you add up all of the different land use management, how much radiative balance of the climate are you actually playing with in land use management versus solar geoengineering? It's not clear to me that it's actually, everyone thinks of geoengineering as being this radical technology that's out there and totally different from responsible management of the climate system. That's often a strong response that people have, and I understand it. But at the same time, when you relate it to aerosol management and the aerosol loading, like we did in air pollution at the beginning of the talk, or you relate it to any stratospheric ozone. There was an interesting proposal Victor and I came across on the weekend to use microwave radiation to regrow the ozone layer in the stratosphere. Thankfully, it's regrowing on its own, so we don't have to do that, but it's, people have been thinking about engineering fixes across all of this. And so where does this leave me? It leaves me with the question, is geoengineering unique? Or is it part of a paradigm shift towards the concept of actively governing our impact on the global environment, actively governing our living planet, and managing the Anthropocene? With that, thank you very much, and I will take your questions.